All right, everybody. So we are moving on towards the Great War in 1914. And just keep in mind that nobody called it World War I at that time. They had no reason to, because they did not know that World War II was coming in a few decades. So everybody called it the Great War. And I want to go over some of the causes of the war, and then especially focus on the devastation, the devastating impacts the war had on society, on the entire world, really. So we have gone pretty quickly through the 1800s. After Napoleon, the French Revolution, the great powers' decision not to put him on trial. We've kind of jumped over a lot of information. Just keep in mind that the Industrial Revolution was important in the 1800s, as well as imperialism. This idea that European powers, especially European powers, were colonizing in places in Africa and Asia, and their empires are going to play a role here in what comes in World War I. So, just some brief context on what total war means, and then we'll talk about the Great War, some of the causes and devastation. I do want you to be thinking about this book I've asked you to read, Not So Quiet, and then we'll have some discussion questions that you can consider discussing if you want to. There are 5 main characteristics that historians use to describe total war, and I've listed them here. The first is mobilization. So the entire society is mobilized to help with the war effort. And sometimes this includes conscription, the draft. So people are contributing in their own ways. The whole society is aimed towards helping with the war effort, and a lot of people are being drafted into the military. So we have mobilization, weaponry. This goes along with industrialization. The weaponry is more advanced, more industrialized, more destructive. And what's important here is that we're beginning to see the emergence, the dominance of indiscriminate warfare. Whereas hundreds of years before this, we had discriminate warfare, where people had to draw their sword on the battlefield and pick a target to attack. In this case, we're beginning to see indiscriminate warfare, where people can just lay down machine gun fire, or they can use explosives and gas attacks to attack people. So there's a difference here in the kind of weaponry. There's a difference there's not as much of a difference anymore between combatants and non-combatants. So the lines are going to be blurred between combatants on the one hand and civilians. The scale is massive. Even the Napoleonic Wars that took place throughout the European continent are going to pale in comparison to the massive scale of the Great War, which is a world war. And I'll show you a map of all the different world powers that were involved. And then, instead of saying laws, I probably should have said lack of laws. The laws of war are going to be disregarded in examples of total war. So those are the 5 main characteristics of what scholars consider total war. Obviously, the Great War is a perfect example of total war, but some scholars will go back before the Great War. Some scholars will even look at the U.S. Civil War as an example of total war. So I just want you to see that there's a difference here. Total war is different from other wars that came in the centuries before 1914. So the causes of World War I, the Great War, are very complicated. There is a acronym that I like to use. It's called MANIA that can help us understand this. The first is militarism. The European powers began to increase their spending on military, their defense spending, technology, and all that. So that's part of it. Lots of alliances. So I'll show you a map or a diagram of that too. Lots of secret alliances as well between nations. Obviously nationalism and sort of national pride play a role. And imperialism, I mentioned before how these powers have colonies all over the place. And then the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A lot of history classes will just focus on that. But that is not the cause. That may have been the catalyst to create the dominoes that fall down. But that by itself is not the cause of World War I. There are a lot of other factors that play into this. Just to show you the increase in defense spending, France, Great Britain, Russia, all increasing. Nobody could compare to Germany, increasing by a massive scale. And then you have all these alliances between the Triple Entente in red and the Triple Alliance in blue. I'm not going to go over all of the history of this. There is a really good video that you can watch online. It's part of that Crash Course World History video series by John Green, and he talks more about the causes of World War I. But you can see how these different European powers formed alliances in the decades before the war started between Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany. Had alliances here with the Ottoman Empire. There was aid being given to Bulgaria. And then over here you have an alliance between Russia and France. You have treaties between Great Britain and Russia, Great Britain and France. And so it's a very tangled web among all these different nations. The assassination was critical, okay? I mean, that obviously is important. But that is not the cause, okay? When the Archduke was killed in 1914, that created a sort of a domino effect where the dominoes began falling, and then the fighting began. You can see on the map, if you look at the Central Powers here in purple, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. You can see the Allied powers in green, Great Britain, France, Russia. Okay. Here's the map of the world, where you can see how all these European powers are warring with each other, but they have colonies in Africa. So the whole continent of Africa is involved in some way. The British control India. The British control Australia and New Zealand. So obviously those regions are also going to be affected. You can see how Brazil participated as well, and the United States finally joins the war effort in 1917. In terms of the devastation, these are just some basic statistics. You have 65 million soldiers who are mobilized in the war. 8.5 million are killed, 22 million wounded. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. The Second World War is going to dwarf these numbers, but nobody knows in 1914 to 1918 that there's another world war coming. So this was the worst war they had ever experienced. So 8.5 million people killed. That is just a huge number. I don't even know how to really imagine how many that is, but that's a lot. And then 22 million are wounded. Unfortunately, because of the medical technology, the medical knowledge at that time, so many of those who were wounded are not going to be able to live a productive life after the war. They're going to become invalids. They are not going to be able to walk or see or do any kinds of things. The quality of life is going to be very bad for these soldiers who do survive. Even though they're wounded and they survive, they're just not going to have a high quality of life. So keep that in mind. If it helps you to see, about 6,000 people on average were dying every day for more than 1,500 days. So it's a lot of people who died during the war. These are some images I wanted to show. This is some soldiers on the front lines who were wearing early versions of gas masks. These are not gas masks that we would see today, but this is what the early forms of them were, which really aren't going to protect against chemical attacks, but that's all they had at the beginning of the war. And then here's a group of soldiers who are blinded from chemical gas, and so they can't see. They're having to hold each other's shoulders so that they can walk together. So, Not So Quiet by Helen Zenna Smith is a work of historical fiction, but it does a really good job of depicting the conditions of war from the perspective of a group of women who are ambulance drivers. The book is actually written by Evadna Price, but her pseudonym, her pen name, was Helen Zenna Smith. And so that's a picture of Evadna Price who wrote the novel. And just some questions you can be thinking about as you're reading. What is this book about? How does it treat nationalism? That's an important part of the book. What impact did the war have on gender roles? How does class affect people's views of the war? Another question you can be thinking about is, how does the war change these individuals from beginning to end? There's also going to be a discussion in the book about the front lines versus the home front. So people who are on the front lines or right behind them at these hospitals, how do their views of the war differ from those who are at the home front in England or other places in Great Britain? You know, what do they think of the war compared to those who are on the front lines, like these women who have to travel to the front lines to save soldiers? So just some things you can be thinking about as you read through the story. What I'd like for you to be working on, we will finish reading that novel, and then there are a couple of primary sources, things that are coming during the war when the U.S. enters, right after the war ends. The Treaty of Versailles is so important, and there are specific articles we will look at. So that's all I've got, everybody. Have a great day, and I will see you online.